Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka felt the twisted metal of his Zero fighter dig into his spine as he pressed against its wreckage, the acrid smell of burning fuel and rubber filling his nostrils. Through the thick jungle smoke that drifted between the towering palm trees, he could hear the steady crunch of boots on fallen leaves growing closer. His heart hammered against his ribs as shadows moved through the haze, and he knew his time had come. The American voices carried through the humid air, speaking in that harsh, guttural language that sounded like grinding stones to his ears. His fingers found the handle of his ceremonial knife, the cool metal familiar against his palm. This was the moment his commanders had prepared him for during those long months of training. Death before dishonor, Captain Yamamoto had drilled into every pilot. The Americans show no mercy to the sons of the rising sun. They will chain you, torture you, force you to betray your emperor and your ancestors. The words echoed in Tanaka's mind as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the jungle's oppressive heat. The first American soldier emerged from the smoke like a ghost materializing from the underworld. Tanaka's breath caught in his throat. The man was younger than he had expected, perhaps 20 or 21, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that seemed strange on what Tanaka had been taught was the face of a demon. The soldier's rifle was raised but not aimed directly at him, and his movements were careful, almost cautious. Behind him, more Americans appeared, their faces grim but not cruel. "Easy there, son," the lead soldier called out, his voice surprisingly gentle. The American raised his free hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture, though Tanaka could not understand the words. "We're not going to hurt you." Tanaka's grip tightened on his knife. The propaganda broadcasts from Tokyo had filled his mind with images of American torture chambers, of Japanese prisoners screaming as they were forced to renounce their loyalty to the emperor. His stomach churned as he remembered the stories whispered among the pilots about medical experiments and slow, agonizing deaths. This kindness in the American's voice must be a trap, a cruel game before the real horror began. To his left, he could see his fellow pilots huddled against the wreckage of their own aircraft. Young Kenji, barely 18 with a face that still held traces of boyhood, was trembling like a leaf in a typhoon. His dark eyes were wide with terror, and tears had cut clean tracks through the dirt and smoke stains on his cheeks. Captain Sato, the veteran who had flown missions over China and survived countless battles, sat with his back straight despite his obvious injuries, but even his weathered face showed the same fear that consumed them all. The American sergeant stepped closer, and Tanaka could see the name Chen stitched above his left breast pocket. There was something in the man's expression that did not match the stories of American brutality. His eyes held what almost looked like compassion, though Tanaka fought against believing such an impossible thing. "Kenji," Tanaka whispered to his young wingman, never taking his eyes off the approaching Americans. "Remember what we learned. Death with honor is better than life with shame." But Kenji only whimpered in response, his whole body shaking as more American soldiers surrounded their small group. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the green walls pressing closer as their captors formed a loose circle. Tanaka waited for the chains, for the ropes that would bind their hands behind their backs, for the first blow or the harsh commands that would begin their descent into the hell their commanders had promised awaited all captured Japanese soldiers. Instead, Sergeant Chen slowly lowered his rifle and reached into his jacket pocket. Tanaka's muscles tensed, preparing for whatever weapon or instrument of torture the American would produce. His thumb moved to the release of his knife's sheath, ready to draw it in one swift motion and end his own life before the Americans could begin their work. But what Chen pulled from his pocket was not chains or rope or any tool of suffering. It was something brown and wrapped in paper, something small and harmless-looking that he held out toward the Japanese pilots with the same careful gentleness he had shown since emerging from the smoke. Tanaka stared at the object in complete confusion, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was not what any of them had expected. This was not what their training had prepared them for. The cultural divide between their two worlds had never felt wider than in this moment, when kindness appeared where cruelty was supposed to reign supreme. He looked at the faces of his fellow pilots and saw his own bewilderment reflected in their eyes. They had steeled themselves for chains and torture, for demands to betray everything they held sacred. They had prepared to die rather than face the shame their culture promised would come with surrender. But instead, they were being offered something none of them recognized, something that looked almost like a gift. We thought they would bind our hands, but instead they offered us something we had never tasted, and we didn't know if it was poison or kindness. Major Robert Harrison's boots echoed against the wooden floorboards of the hastily constructed interrogation facility as he surveyed the scene before him with mounting bewilderment. The tropical air hung thick and oppressive inside the corrugated metal building on Saipan, where ceiling fans churned lazily overhead, doing little more than redistributing the stifling heat. Rows of captured Japanese pilots sat rigidly on crude wooden crates, their backs straight as steel rods, eyes fixed on invisible points somewhere beyond the horizon. None of them had moved in the past 4 hours. "Sir, they won't take the chocolate," Sergeant Martinez reported, his voice tinged with confusion as he gestured toward the untouched Hershey bars scattered on the ground beside each prisoner. "They won't even look at it." Harrison ran a weathered hand through his graying hair, feeling the weight of his 23 years of military service pressing down on his shoulders. He had interrogated German officers who spat defiance, Italian soldiers who wept for their mothers, and French resistance fighters who traded information for cigarettes. But these Japanese prisoners presented something entirely alien to his experience. They sat like living statues, their silence more impenetrable than any fortress wall he had ever encountered. Captain Williams, the camp's newly assigned psychologist, circled the prisoners with the methodical precision of a scientist studying laboratory specimens. His clipboard remained poised in his hands as he scribbled observations about what he termed Oriental behavioral patterns in his neat handwriting. The captain paused beside one particularly young pilot whose uniform bore the insignia of a flight lieutenant, studying the man's impassive features with clinical detachment. "It's fascinating, Major," Williams murmured, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "This apparent stubbornness seems to be culturally ingrained. They're exhibiting classic signs of what I would classify as pathological resistance to authority." Harrison suppressed a grimace at the psychologist's oversimplified assessment. The manual tucked under his arm, its pages already dog-eared from constant reference, contained detailed protocols for handling European prisoners, but offered nothing useful for this situation. Every technique he had learned, every psychological approach that had proven effective in previous campaigns, seemed to dissolve into meaninglessness in the face of this profound silence. Hiroshi Tanaka remained motionless on his assigned crate, third from the left in the front row, his dark eyes fixed on a water stain spreading across the opposite wall. The chocolate bar beside him had begun to soften in the relentless heat, its brown surface developing a glossy sheen as it slowly surrendered to the tropical climate. The sweet aroma that should have been tempting instead filled him with a deep sense of unease that gnawed at his stomach like hunger itself. His father's voice echoed in his memory, stern and unwavering from years of childhood instruction. "A true warrior accepts nothing from his enemies, for to do so is to dishonor not only yourself, but 7 generations of your ancestors." The words had been spoken during one of their evening walks through the cherry orchards behind their family home, when Hiroshi was barely 8 years old and more interested in catching fireflies than absorbing lessons about honor and duty. The American guards whispered among themselves near the entrance, their voices carrying easily across the silent room despite their attempts at discretion. Private Johnson, barely 19 and still sporting the pale complexion of someone fresh from the farms of Iowa, shook his head in obvious frustration. "I don't get it, Tommy," he muttered to his companion, a stockier soldier from Detroit named Murphy. "Back home, if someone gave you chocolate, you'd say thank you and eat it. These guys are just weird." Murphy nodded in agreement, shifting his rifle from one shoulder to the other. "Maybe they think it's poisoned or something. My uncle fought in the last war, and he said the Germans tried all kinds of tricks." Their speculation drifted across the room like smoke, reaching the ears of the prisoners who understood far more English than their captors realized. Several of the Japanese airmen had studied at universities before the war, and others had learned the language through their military training. But none of them betrayed this knowledge through so much as a flicker of recognition. Harrison approached Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, the base intelligence officer who had arrived that morning with a briefcase full of reports and recommendations from Washington. Patterson's uniform remained crisp despite the humidity, and his expression carried the confident bearing of someone who believed that every problem had a solution waiting to be discovered in the right manual or protocol. "Colonel, I need guidance here," Harrison said, keeping his voice low enough that the prisoners couldn't overhear. "These men aren't responding to any standard approaches. They won't eat, won't speak, won't even acknowledge our presence." Patterson consulted a thick folder marked with red classification stamps, his finger tracing down columns of typed recommendations. "The analysts in Washington suggest that increased pressure might be necessary. Perhaps restricting water rations or implementing sleep deprivation techniques. The report indicates that Oriental prisoners require firmer handling than their European counterparts." The suggestion settled uneasily in Harrison's stomach. He had seen the effects of harsh interrogation methods during his tours in North Africa and Italy, and while they sometimes produced information, they also created hatred that lasted far beyond the end of any particular battle. These prisoners, despite their silence, showed no signs of the defiance or aggression that typically preceded the need for such measures. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature inside the facility climbed steadily, turning the air thick enough to taste. The chocolate bars continued their slow surrender to the heat, creating small puddles of brown sweetness that attracted flies and filled the room with an increasingly cloying aroma. The contrast between the intended kindness of the gesture and its gradual corruption in the tropical heat seemed to symbolize something larger that Harrison couldn't quite articulate. Tanaka felt sweat beading along his hairline, but he refused to wipe it away. Even such a small gesture might be interpreted as weakness by his fellow prisoners, and weakness in the face of the enemy was a concept that existed beyond the boundaries of acceptable thought. The meditation techniques taught by his grandfather helped him focus his mind away from physical discomfort, transforming the heat and humidity into distant sensations that belonged to someone else's experience. Radio Tokyo had prepared them for torture, for interrogation, for the cruel treatment that their propaganda had promised would be their fate if captured. Sensei Watanabe, their flight instructor, had spoken at length about the importance of maintaining silence even under the most extreme duress. "The Americans will try to break your spirit," he had warned during their final briefing before the mission. "They will use pain and fear to extract our military secrets, but a true warrior endures all things in service to the Emperor." But no one had prepared them for chocolate bars and concerned expressions. No one had warned them about guards who seemed genuinely puzzled by their silence rather than angered by it. The Americans' apparent kindness created a psychological labyrinth more confusing than any physical torture could have been, because it challenged every assumption they had been trained to hold about their enemies. Captain Williams completed another circuit of the prisoners, his observations growing more elaborate with each pass. He paused to examine the untouched food and water that had been provided, making additional notes about what he perceived as ritualistic rejection of Western offerings. His clinical detachment prevented him from recognizing the profound cultural forces at work, reducing complex concepts of honor and duty to simple behavioral quirks that could be cataloged and analyzed. The day stretched toward evening, and still the chocolate bars remained untouched. Some had melted completely, leaving dark stains on the wooden floor that would require scrubbing. Others maintained their shape but had softened beyond recognition, their surfaces bearing the imprints of curious insects drawn by the sweetness. The metaphor was almost too obvious to ignore. Good intentions corrupted by misunderstanding, kindness rendered meaningless by cultural blindness. Harrison found himself standing at the window, watching the sun begin its descent toward the Pacific horizon. The orange light filtering through the facility cast long shadows across the rows of silent prisoners, making them appear even more statuesque and mysterious than before. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered an enemy who wielded silence as effectively as these men wielded their weapons. As darkness approached, the prisoners maintained their vigil beside the melting chocolate, convinced that accepting anything from their captors would bring dishonor to their families for generations to come. The American guards continued their whispered speculation, while intelligence officers in Washington read field reports and recommended increasingly harsh measures for dealing with what they perceived as simple stubbornness. The institutional machinery of war ground forward, processing these unusual prisoners through a system designed for enemies who followed familiar patterns of behavior. But in this small facility on a Pacific island, a more complex drama was unfolding, one where kindness became cruelty through misunderstanding, and where silence spoke louder than any words could have. The chocolate sat there for 3 days, melting in the heat, while we waited for the torture that never came. Dr. Samuel Kellerman stepped through the gates of the Saipan detention camp with his medical bag clutched tightly in his left hand and classified orders burning in his coat pocket. The September heat pressed against his uniform like a suffocating blanket, but the chill that ran down his spine had nothing to do with the tropical weather. Behind wire fences, dozens of Japanese prisoners sat in perfect rows, their backs straight despite weeks of captivity, their eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the horizon. "Doctor, thank God you're here," called out Major Harrison, a tall man whose sunburned face revealed months of frustration. "These prisoners won't eat, won't talk, won't even acknowledge our existence. Washington wants answers, and they want them fast." Kellerman nodded slowly, his own memories of persecution flickering like shadows across his mind. He had fled Nazi Germany barely 5 years ago, carrying nothing but his medical degree and the haunting echoes of his father's voice telling him to survive, no matter the cost. Now, standing before men who had been taught that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, he felt an uncomfortable recognition stirring in his chest. "What methods have you tried?" Kellerman asked, setting down his bag near the camp's administrative tent. Major Harrison wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Everything by the book, Doc. Hot meals 3 times a day, medical attention, clean quarters. Hell, we even brought in a chaplain. But look at them." Kellerman's gaze swept across the compound, taking in details that others had missed. Untouched chocolate bars lay scattered near the prisoners' feet like discarded offerings. Tin cups of water sat full and warming in the sun, ignored despite the obvious thirst etched in the men's faces. In the corner of the nearest barracks, a young prisoner sat trembling, his body clearly weakened by days without food, yet his jaw remained set with determined defiance. "That one there," Kellerman pointed toward the trembling young man. "How long has he been refusing meals?" 4 days now. Private Kenji, according to his dog tags. Kids maybe 19, 20 at most. Medic says he'll collapse soon if he doesn't eat something. Kellerman approached the fence slowly, studying Private Kenji's hollow cheeks and the way his hands shook as he maintained his rigid posture. The young soldier's eyes followed the doctor's movement, alert despite his physical weakness. There was something in that gaze that Kellerman recognized, not hatred, but terror disguised as pride. "He's not refusing food out of stubbornness," Kellerman murmured more to himself than to Major Harrison. "He's afraid of it." "Afraid of food? Doc, that doesn't make any sense." But Kellerman was already walking toward another section of the camp, where an older prisoner sat methodically scratching marks into the wooden wall of his barracks. Captain Sato, according to the nameplate outside his quarters, had been the highest-ranking officer captured during the island's final battle. His weathered hands moved with ceremonial precision, carving symbols that clearly weren't counting days. "What is he writing?" Kellerman asked Sergeant Chen, a Chinese-American guard who stood nearby with a captured Japanese dictionary tucked under his arm. Chen adjusted his glasses and squinted at the wall markings. "Been trying to figure that out myself, Doc. My grandmother used to tell stories about old Chinese funeral rites, and this looks similar. I think he's preparing death prayers." "Death prayers? For whom?" "Near as I can tell, for himself and his men, like he's getting ready for execution." Kellerman felt his stomach tighten. "Have any of the prisoners been threatened with execution?" "Not officially," Chen replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But scuttlebutt around camp is that Washington's getting impatient. Some of the guards have been talking about applying pressure, whatever that means." The pieces of a terrible puzzle began forming in Kellerman's mind. He watched as several American guards approached the fence with family photographs, holding them up hopefully toward the prisoners. The soldiers, boys really, most of them from farms and factories back home, spoke in gentle voices, showing pictures of their wives, their children, their dogs. "Look here, buddy," one young guard said to Private Kenji, holding up a photo of a smiling woman holding a baby. "This is my wife Susan and our boy Tommy. He just turned 2 last month. You got family back home?" "Kids?" Private Kenji's eyes flickered toward the photograph for just a moment before snapping back to that invisible point on the horizon. His trembling intensified, and Kellerman noticed tears forming at the corners of the young man's eyes, tears he fought desperately to contain. "They think kindness is torture," Kellerman whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "What did you say, Doc?" Major Harrison asked, approaching with a stack of intelligence reports in his hands. "These men aren't resisting our humanitarian treatment," Kellerman explained, his voice growing urgent. "They're terrified by it. In their military culture, prisoners are treated brutally before execution. Our kindness convinces them that we're preparing them for something far worse than quick death." Major Harrison's face darkened as he flipped through the reports. "Well, Doc, ready or not, you're about to get new orders from Washington. These arrived an hour ago." He handed Kellerman a sealed envelope marked with urgent classification stamps. Kellerman's hands trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope and read the contents. The official language was carefully neutral, but the message was clear. Apply enhanced interrogation methods to extract intelligence about Japanese defensive positions on other islands. The men in Washington, sitting safely behind desks thousands of miles away, had grown tired of waiting for voluntary cooperation. "When do these orders take effect?" Kellerman asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning. They want you to start with the young one, Private Kenji. Apparently, intelligence believes he has information about ammunition depots on nearby islands." Kellerman looked back at Private Kenji, who continued to shake with hunger and fear while maintaining his dignified posture. The young man's sacrifice, starving himself rather than accepting what he believed was his captor's cruel mockery, reminded Kellerman of stories his grandfather had told about Jewish prisoners who chose death over collaboration with their oppressors. "Sir," Sergeant Chen interrupted quietly, "I've been learning some Japanese phrases from this dictionary. Would it help if I tried talking to them in their own language?" Major Harrison shrugged. "Can't hurt at this point." "What have you learned?" Chen cleared his throat nervously and approached the fence. In halting, carefully pronounced Japanese, he said something that made several prisoners turn their heads in surprise. Captain Sato stopped carving his funeral prayers and stared directly at the Chinese-American sergeant. "What did you tell them?" Kellerman asked. "I said that we want to help them live, not die. I told them we have no plans to execute them." The response was immediate and unexpected. Several prisoners began talking among themselves in rapid Japanese, their voices carrying a tone of confusion and desperate hope. Private Kenji's trembling intensified, but now his eyes searched the faces of his guards with something that might have been the beginning of trust. Captain Sato stood slowly and approached the fence. In broken English, he spoke his first words since capture. "You speak truth. No death. For us." The moment hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful and fragile. Kellerman felt the weight of the orders in his pocket and the crushing responsibility of dozens of lives hanging in the balance. Tomorrow, those same orders would force him to choose between following commands from men who had never looked into a prisoner's eyes and honoring the oath he had taken to first do no harm. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the compound, Kellerman realized that the collision between institutional blindness and individual compassion was about to explode in ways no one could predict. The men in Washington wanted results. The guards wanted to do right by their prisoners, and the Japanese soldiers wanted nothing more than to die with honor intact. But Private Kenji's whispered words, translated by Sergeant Chen, would echo in Kellerman's mind long into the sleepless night ahead. We had trained our hearts to face death, but no one had taught us how to face mercy. 3 weeks had crawled by since the chocolate incident, each day stretching like an eternity in the suffocating heat of the Pacific interrogation facility. The American officers had grown accustomed to the maddening silence that greeted their every attempt at communication. Dr. Kellerman sat in his cramped office, reviewing his notes for what felt like the 1,000th time, when the unexpected happened. Private Kenji, the youngest of the Japanese prisoners, had been staring at the wall for hours when his cracked lips finally parted. The words that emerged were barely a whisper, so faint that Sergeant Chen had to lean forward, straining to catch every syllable. The translation that followed hit the room like a physical blow. "He wants to know," Chen said slowly, his voice thick with disbelief, "if the candy was meant to make him forget his mother's face before you execute him." Dr. Kellerman felt the blood drain from his face. The clipboard in his hands trembled as the full weight of those words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Major Harrison, who had been observing from the corner, stepped forward with narrowed eyes. "What did he just say?" Harrison demanded, though the translation had been crystal clear. Chen's hands shook as he repeated the question to Kenji in Japanese, desperate to ensure he had understood correctly. The young soldier's response came in a torrent of broken whispers, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks as 3 weeks of terror finally found its voice. "Sir," Chen said, his own voice cracking, "they think the chocolate was poison. Not to kill them quickly, but to make them forget who they are before the torture begins. They believe we're playing with their minds, making them comfortable so the pain will be worse when it comes." The revelation crashed through the room like a tsunami of understanding. Dr. Kellerman's carefully constructed theories about Japanese military psychology crumbled in an instant. These men hadn't been defying American authority through disciplined silence. They had been paralyzed by a terror so profound that they chose slow starvation over what they believed was elaborate psychological torture. Over the following days, as Chen worked patiently to break through the language barrier and the walls of fear, the horrifying truth emerged piece by piece. Japanese military propaganda had painted Americans not as mere enemies, but as sadistic monsters who delighted in breaking their prisoners' spirits before destroying their bodies. Every act of kindness, every gesture of humanity, had been reframed as evidence of American cruelty. "They told us," Kenji whispered through Chen's translation, his voice hollow with exhaustion, "that Americans give comfort to prisoners only to make the suffering sweeter when it comes. The chocolate, the clean water, the medical care, it's all part of the game." Captain Sato, who had maintained his dignified silence the longest, sat slumped against the wall of his cell. His uniform hung loose on his skeletal frame, and his eyes had taken on the glassy stare of a man pushed beyond his limits. The chocolate bar that had been left in his cell weeks ago had melted and reformed countless times in the tropical heat, creating a brown smear across the metal floor. Dr. Kellerman watched through the observation window as Sato finally reached for the ruined candy. The captain's hands trembled violently as he scraped the chocolate from the floor, tears streaming down his face as he convinced himself he was betraying everything sacred his country had taught him to believe. "I'm sorry, honorable ancestors," Sato whispered in Japanese, the words carrying clearly through the thin walls. I'm sorry, Mother. I cannot be strong anymore." The chocolate dissolved on his tongue, and with it, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the world. It wasn't poison. It wasn't a mind-altering drug designed to strip away his identity. It was just candy, sweet, simple, and heartbreakingly ordinary. Zato's sobs echoed through the facility as the weight of realization crushed down upon him. 3 weeks of self-imposed starvation, 3 weeks of terror, all based on lies his own leaders had fed him about the nature of his captors. Dr. Kellerman's reports to Washington laid bare the complete failure of American intelligence to understand their enemy's psychology. The thick manila envelopes that made their way up the chain of command contained page after page of devastating analysis, exposing how institutional arrogance had transformed simple human decency into a source of paralyzing fear. "We assumed," Kellerman wrote in his final assessment, "that their silence represented defiance born of military discipline. We never considered that it might represent terror born of systematic indoctrination. Our acts of kindness, interpreted through the lens of their propaganda, became instruments of torture more effective than anything we might have devised intentionally." The most shocking revelation came when American intelligence intercepted Japanese radio broadcasts from Tokyo. The enemy's own propaganda machine had seized upon the chocolate torture story, broadcasting it across the Pacific as proof of American barbarity. The bitter irony was inescapable. Japanese leaders were using their own soldiers' suffering as propaganda ammunition, never knowing that their own lies were literally killing the men they claimed to honor. Major Harrison stood in the sweltering communications center, reading the intercepted transcripts with growing amazement. Tokyo radio was telling the world about American psychological warfare techniques that didn't exist, describing elaborate torture methods that were actually acts of basic human compassion. "They're using our kindness against us," Harrison muttered, shaking his head in disbelief, "and they don't even realize their own people are dying from fear of it." As the weeks passed and more prisoners began to break their silence, a pattern emerged that would reshape American understanding of the Pacific War. The Japanese Empire had created soldiers so thoroughly indoctrinated that they literally could not recognize human decency when they encountered it. Every gesture of compassion was filtered through a lens of suspicion and terror, transformed into evidence of the very cruelty it was meant to oppose. The war's most profound victory, Dr. Kellerman realized, wouldn't be measured in ships sunk or islands captured. It would be measured in moments like these, when starving men learned that sometimes chocolate really was just chocolate, and that the monsters their leaders had described existed only in the fevered imagination of wartime propaganda. Years later, when the guns had fallen silent and the world began the long process of healing, former Private Hiroshi Tanaka would sit in his small Tokyo apartment, writing his memoirs with shaking hands. The words came slowly, each sentence a painful excavation of memories he had tried so hard to bury. "The day I ate that chocolate bar, I didn't just taste sweetness. I tasted the lie my own country had fed me about the nature of my enemies. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of mercy, humanity, and the power of compassion even amid war. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, understanding, and peace beyond conflict."